Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel video. Today what I thought we'd do is we would talk a little bit about some of the skills that we'd like to see buffed after the recent World Championship qualifiers. So for those of you that don't know, typically after a GRF or WCQ concludes, Konami will take a look at some of the data and work out things they think need some adjustments, and that comes in the form of banning and restricting cards, unbanning and unrestricting cards, as well as making modifications to skills, either buffing them or nerfing them. The most impactful of these was probably the nerf to Hell Tuning Invasion that basically killed that skill and killed the deck and forced all of the Royal Rebel players to start playing Death Doom Invasion instead. But before we talk about that, I'd like to talk about a couple of cards that we missed out in our last video when talking about the cards and skills that we thought were going to get nerfed from before. And the first one I want to talk about is Maximum Ragnarok. So Maximum Ragnarok is, it's somewhat unassuming. I think some people saw the skill and thought it was going to be really overpowered. Some people saw the skill initially and thought this was going to be a bit mid. I personally lean towards thinking it was going to be a bit mid camp, but that's before we got the introduction of Chaos Femtron. So before Chaos Femtron came out, Maximum Ragnarok and Cyberse as a whole felt a little bit underwhelming. It was okay, it was doing fine, it had a few tops, I think it won a couple of tournaments, it was doing okay. It was a bit middling in how it was doing, but still okay. It was a decent deck. We kept calling this the worst best deck. But with the introduction of Chaos Femtron, things started to change around. Chaos Femtron is a very powerful card that allows the deck to plus, it allows you to put cards into the graveyard, which if you're playing something like Attribute Hydron is really beneficial. But most importantly, this deck now just gets to do these really crazy, somewhat unfair things. And I think a big part of what's made it so strong is the downfall of Royal Rebels. And what do I mean by that? Well, Maximum Ragnarok decks have this tendency to summon out multiple big boss monsters very quickly before you're really able to respond to it. And whereas usually something like Doom Metal could come out and punish this sort of play, but with the decline of Royal Rebels' popularity, that does mean that Maximum Ragnarok and Cyberse as a whole is really starting to come into its own and become a bit of a meta threat. So, what I would like seen done to this skill is quite simply to remove the 800 attack reduction. So why would I like to see the 800 reduction gone? Well, first off, it allows you to break boards very easily with an archetype that doesn't really need help breaking boards. So what that ends up meaning a lot of the time is you just get a ton of extra damage in. Since you're already playing a lot of 1500 vanillas and your boss monsters are pretty okay statted at 23 and 25 apiece, you can clear pretty much anything anyway, especially since your Attribute Hydron can boost itself up and the Spectacle Mani can weaken your opponent's monsters. So it's not like you're in need of the extra 800. What it does mean is that if your opponent has 2300 or less monsters, now your 15s can clear them very easily. As well as the fact that if you are able to establish a 3 Cyberse board including a Bespectacle Mani, you can reduce a monster's attack by 900 and then an extra 800 on top, which just means you just get a ton of damage in. And especially if you have access to Attribute Hydron who can boost its attack well over 3000, you can just get in for a crap ton of damage, which just seems a little bit too much. I think getting rid of the 800 wouldn't really kill the deck. I think it would be like a tiny slap on the wrist, but I think it is a justified slap on the wrist considering this deck is seemingly the second best deck in the game. As we've been seeing from the results of the WCQ, a ton of people seem to be on this deck and getting really good results using it. I do think getting rid of that 800 attack reduction would be enough to kind of curve the deck just a little bit and make it a little bit more bearable to play against. So the other deck that I've seen people say is problematic, but hasn't got quite the same representation or results as Ragnarok, is another maximum skill, and that is Maximum Overload. So this is a bit of a weird one, because Overlord is a very frustrating deck because it can just kind of win out of nowhere, and I think a lot of people just don't like the deck because of that. But this deck has some really bad matchups and wasn't overly represented. People are still playing this deck, it's still seeing a lot of play, it's just not really dominant anymore, it's not winning as much, and I think a big part of that was Negate Attack's introduction into the game. But if we were going to hit this, I again would just like to see the 800 reduction removed from this skill. Now, this deck doesn't really rely on 800 reduction, it doesn't really need it, because the beneficial part of this skill really is being able to put the maximum monsters back on top of your deck, and being able to unbrick yourself by cheating out monsters. So I think, again, getting rid of the 800 won't change the identity of this deck, it won't really change the way the deck plays, it'll just be like another little slap on the wrist to make the people that really don't like this deck have something they can kind of latch onto and be like, okay, we at least did hit it somehow. Now, let's talk about some skills I would like to see buffed. So for any of you that don't know, the last time we had a GRF, Konami did buff 2 skills. Now, one of those was Tempest Drive, and the other one was Servant of Dawn. And Servant of Dawn did see a little bit of playability. Servant of Dawn did actually manage to win a couple of tournaments, so that buff did help out quite a bit. However, Tempest Drive was not really in the same boat. Unfortunately, even with the buff to this skill, it still hasn't really seen play. The Tempest Drive is the Road Magic Tempest skill, and this is designed to be used with Bender Break, which is a really bad boss monster. So what does this skill do? This skill can be used if the only monsters in your deck are spellcasters or beasts. So that's already quite a harsh restriction, considering all the beasts kind of suck outside of the beast engine. Requirement none. Effect, one face-up wind attribute monster on your field gains 600 attack to the end of this turn. So 600 is, it's fine. It's not a huge amount, but it's fine. Then you can set one Road Magic Tempest from your hand or deck in your spell and trap zone. Okay, so if it's from your hand, okay, we lose a card. If we use it from our deck, it's a +1. Then if we have set it from our hand, we can add a wind attribute monster from our deck to our hand. So again, it does replace that. So even though it would -1 from using a card from my hand, we are replacing it, and it's a tutor as well, which is quite good. So how would I change or just buff this skill? So first things first, I would change the restriction on this so it's not just only spellcasters and beasts. I think changing it so that 1400 or more attack monsters would probably be better. That way you can have a few more of those more useful low-level monsters that could maybe help out the deck in some way, something like Siesta Torero, maybe something like an Essel, right? Just start using those lower level monsters to actually do something. And the other thing I would actually change with this is I would add an optional effect to this, which lets you shuffle Road Magic Tempest from your graveyard into the deck. And why would I want that? Well, the idea is that we want to retain the identity of the skill, and the most interesting part of the skill, in my opinion, is that if we set Road Magic Tempest from our hand, we get that search. So I think by putting it back into our deck, we then have the capability to draw into it again, and then use the effect to set it back to the field and then get that search as well, which I think is more interesting than just being able to set the card from your graveyard. Having access to the card from your graveyard would be nice, because it's basically just a way to change battle positions, which is fine. But realistically, I think if we want this skill to retain its identity and have this really cool search effect, I think it'd be better to actually just be able to shuffle the Tempest back into our deck after we've already used it. Tempest itself is not great, realistically. We have to have a level 7 or higher spellcaster monster, which most of the time is going to be 7's Road Magician, but there are some outliers. We do have quite a few different spellcaster monsters we can use with this now. We have to send a wind monster from our hand to the graveyard. Again, that's not too bad, but it is still a discard, and discarding cards is really not what we want from a skill like this. But I don't think these buffs would make Tempest Drive suddenly really, really good. I don't think it would suddenly then make it a tournament meta deck, but I think it would be a little step in the right direction just to make it a little bit more playable, rather than the minuscule buff it got last time. The next skill I want to talk about is kind of a fan favorite, and this is Daybreak Order. This is the Ride Across skill. Now, Ride Across is a very, very weak monster. 2100 attack is really not great, and its effect to shuffle 2 spellcaster monsters from your graveyard into the deck to special summon up to 2 level 5 or lower spellcaster monsters from your hand is clunky. We basically have to rely on the skill to do a lot of the heavy lifting here. But even if we are able to kind of fix all of the issues with the consistency of this deck, the problem is these cards all still have terrible attack and defense. So ideally we want the skill to do something about that, but we can't have everything. But this skill can be used if the only monsters in your deck are level 7 or lower spellcaster type or warrior type monsters. It can be activated if you return 1 card from your hand to your deck from your second turn onwards. We can reveal 1 level 5 or 7 light attribute monster to our opponent and add a level 5 light attribute monster or Ride Across Hero of the Dawn from your deck to your hand. Then you can add 1 Rightful Magic from your deck to your hand once per duel. So basically we have to shuffle a card from our hand away, and then we can replace that card with a different card from my deck. We can basically tutor out either a Ride Across or one of our level 5 light attribute monsters. So the first thing I would really want to do with this is get rid of that returning a card from your hand to the deck, because realistically this deck should be plussing in some way. I think being forced to get rid of a card from your hand to then add effectively a bad card to your hand isn't really a good look. I think the way to balance this deck is to accept that your board's going to be kind of weak, but then give you extra cards to try and make up for it, and use those extra cards to try and make up that difference if we possibly can. So what I would do is just remove the requirement entirely. But I don't want to stop there. I would change the Rightful Magic part of the skill to be, instead of adding a Rightful Magic from your deck to your hand once per duel, I would change this so you can set Rightful Magic from your deck or graveyard to your field and get rid of the once per duel. So why would I do this? So basically, the idea is that a lot of very, very powerful skills at the moment in the game have the ability to just weaken your opponent's monsters every turn. We think things like the Thunder skill, we think the maximum Ragnarok, maximum Overlord, all of these skills have these really good ways to either buff your monsters or reduce your opponent's monsters' attack. So letting you have Rightful Magic on the field every turn means basically that we will have access to a similar type of effect, right? We'll be able to keep gaining the effect of Rightful Magic, which just weakens by 600, which basically a lot of other skills already have tied into them anyway. This just keeps it on theme of keeping Rightful Magic in, since it is kind of a ride across support card. Because we're setting it to the field, we then can't abuse that +1 by discarding it for any other costs for effects, as well as the fact that only being able to do it once per duel feels really, really bad when, again, like we previously said, a load of other skills get to do this every turn for free without even having to play Rightful Magic as a potential brick in the deck. So that's how I would change this. I would basically make it so it +2s you every turn, but that +2 is maybe a little bit deceptive because Rightful Magic, it might as well just be a 600 decrease, which a lot of other skills have built in anyway, so it's really only a +1 if you really think about it. And finally, we have one more skill to talk about, and this is a Gavin Sugetsu skill, and that is the Dark Arts of Positioning. So Semi-Ruler, first off, is limit 3 for seemingly no reason. I do not understand why this card is limit 3, and I would love for this card to come off of limit 3 first and foremost, just because this card being at limit 3 really does hurt any chance this deck has of doing anything, even though no matter what buffs we stick on this skill, it's still realistically not going to make it very, very strong. But the main thing I would change about this skill is shuffling a card from your hand into the deck. Because why does this skill have to basically break even when it's a bad skill attached to a limit 3 anyway? So for anyone that doesn't know, from turn 2 onwards we can shuffle one card from our hand into the deck, then reveal one level 6 fairy monster with 0 attack from our hand to add a Semi-Ruler from our deck to our hand. That is the most important thing. We're getting rid of a card from our hand and replacing it with Semi-Ruler. When realistically, I don't see why we can't just add a Semi-Ruler and not have to get rid of a card from our hand, especially since Semi-Ruler is quite hard to use in the first place. It's a double tribute monster, so we'd have to normal summon, tribute both to summon out the Semi-Ruler, discard a card from our hand just to use his effect, so the requirement is send a card from your hand to the graveyard, and then have the 0 attack monster in our hand to get out. That's already a 5 card hand. So realistically, one extra card I don't think breaks that. Maybe it means we actually have a back row or another monster that we can set on the field, which does feel a lot better. Now, even with this, I don't think Dark Arts of Positioning is going to be a very, very strong deck, but it'll at least be somewhat playable. I don't know why Konami really hates some of these archetypes. They seem to really hate Gavin, they really hate the Warriors, and I don't even get me started on the Psychics. Konami seem to absolutely just despise Psychics for whatever reason. But yeah, those are the skills I would like to see buffed, and realistically, Konami could buff whatever they want, however they want, and I think it's really hard to actually predict what we think they're going to do, so instead I've kind of got my own wish list of what I would like to see. And I'd really like to hear your opinions down in the comments, and if there are any other skills I didn't mention that you would like to see buffed, please let me know what those skills are and how you would buff them. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.